Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before I let you go for the Christmas and Hanukkah holidays, I need you to go to jointheunion.us. That's jointheunion.us. Guys, the union has been a backbone of the grassroots and volunteer effort in American politics since 2022, and we are going to make an even bigger impact in 2025, but we can't do it without you. Please go to jointheunion.us and sign up today. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Ron Insana, CEO of i-fi.ai and a senior analyst and commentator at CNBC. Ron has more than 3 decades experience in the economic sector as a business journalist and a money manager. He's written 4 books on Wall Street and is a sought-after lecturer on domestic and global economics, financial markets, and economic policy issues. Today, he's coming to us from Englewood, New Jersey. Ron, welcome back.
Good to see you, my friend. And it's actually now 4 decades, believe it or not.
Oh my God. Well, I'm sorry. Well, I would be lying. I have a cold and I am in a mood, and I am sorry for that. But maybe
Be gentle with me.
tis the season. Now you're a Jersey guy. I have no worries about what's going to happen. So let's talk about this. Literally, right as we turn the mics on, you and I had been texting earlier in the morning about, a couple of days ago, the market was down 1,100 points. Its longest slide since the 1970s. The Fed didn't do what the market thought it was going to do. And now, as we're recording this, it's back up 700, which I assume means it's pretty close to even over the last couple of days. Listening to some of the reports, and we'll get into some of the more pressing political and economic stuff. I mean, it seems that like the Fed and Chairman Powell were pretty clear about what he was and wasn't going to do. Like, why was this such a surprise?
Well, people had been pricing in what they called a hawkish cut from the Federal Reserve. In other words, the notion that the Fed was going to cut one more time, which it did on Wednesday, on the 18th, reduced rates by a quarter point, bringing the cumulative rate reduction over the last 3 meetings to a full percentage point, and then suggested that next year there might only be 2 interest rate reductions. Wall Street had been betting on 4. The Fed also raised its inflation estimates for 2025 because we've gotten a little sticky with some prices that haven't come down nearly as much, particularly housing, maybe groceries to an extent, and haven't quite come down. There are also some really weird quirks in this, insurance costs, the cost of financial services. So when the market's going up, you actually pay more to your financial advisor because their assets under management are increasing, so their fees increase, and that counts as inflation, which isn't really inflation. But it's one of the pieces of
It
data.
is to me.
Well, you're still netting out at 30% a year, so you're good.
Right.
But that all of that kind of stickiness that we saw, where inflation measures were stuck around 2.5%, gave the Fed some reason to say, hey, look, we're not going to go all out in cutting rates. And they also implied that given the uncertainty over the policy mix that the incoming Trump administration has discussed publicly, they won't admit it, but I'm sure that's a factor in slowing them down, trying to determine whether this combination of things that the incoming administration wants to do could essentially be inflationary. So they're watchful and waiting to see how that plays out in legislative and regulatory actions.
I want to get to all that, but before we do that, I want to lean back on what I'll call Eco 101 for Reed. So you talked about housing. That seems to be a function of, that inflation and higher interest rates meant that people like me had locked in very low rates, weren't going to leave because, we weren't going to get as good a deal. But also there seems to be a supply issue as well, which is obviously basic economics. So less supply, more squeeze, less people moving, obviously higher prices. And so, I laughed to myself this past summer when I was in Chicago at the Democratic convention that of all people, it was Barack Obama saying maybe we should reduce regulations to increase housing starts. Like, that seems like a long way away from sort of, traditional Democratic, orthodoxy. But we see it in places certainly like California and elsewhere where they just make it really, really difficult to build housing, whether or not it's single family, multifamily, whatever apartments, whatever it is. But the truth is, like, people got to live somewhere and they can't afford not to.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think we're short somewhere between 4 and 6 million homes relative to demand. And so some of that is the result of the great financial crisis having slowed building in the aftermath of that in 2008 and 2009. Then the pandemic, of course, brought all building to a halt. And so you had, again, another shock to the housing system, if you will, or the housing industry, if you will. And so we haven't kept pace. We're nowhere near the types of housing starts, building permits that we saw at prior peaks. And so, yeah, that it's a really a supply problem that's met with a demand problem because you do have millennials forming families, even some Gen Z kids are getting married. My oldest daughter, most recently.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you. And so, as they form families and start looking for homes, they're kind of priced out of the market, so they're stuck renting. You have some private equity players who are still owning a chunk of the houses they bought after the financial crisis, which was a necessary way to stabilize prices. But what they did not do is release those homes for sale. They're still renting them out because they're getting great cash flow. So it's a relatively small percentage, but it's enough to move the needle a little bit in terms of pricing. And since 2019, home prices are up around 40%, way above what we've seen the overall inflation rate go up or the overall price level go up. And so it is a real problem. And zoning is part of the issue. And President Obama was right, and even Vice President Harris mentioned it, that they were looking for ways to incentivize states and municipalities to ease up on zoning restrictions so more homes could be built.
Right, and I'd be interested too is, there are a heck of a lot more efficient, I assume, and cheaper ways to build houses nowadays than just, the traditional foundation, framing, all that other stuff. But of course, too, there's an incentive from the home building market to not have that be more in use as well, right? I mean, it's like, no, they want all this stuff, and the lumber guys want to keep selling two by fours, and the roofers want to keep selling shingles, and so it's one of those things where it's a massive supply chain, not just a matter of saying how do I get Ron into a new house because he can't afford to buy one otherwise.
Well, if you can figure that out, I really appreciate it. But there's a lot of prefab stuff that's going up too, right? I mean, there's modular homes that get built. One actually down the street from us was kind of put in place that way, where like an entire brick wall was prefabricated and that went up. There's a solar roof, which is different than conventional roofing, and that can bring down the overall cost of constructing a home. And so, yeah, I mean, as in any industry, you have vested interests that don't like to see disruptive change. There's a lot of talk about 3D printed homes. That may still be a ways away, but the technology is there, and you can build a reasonably sizable home, in a 2,000 or 2,400 square foot range, which is effectively still average, and create a less expensive home. It's just not happening at scale, and that's what's keeping housing prices, along with those of you who own homes with the very low mortgage rates,
Right,
from increasing the supplies. Why would you go to a smaller house for more money?
right.
Mortgage rates are back above 7% this week. And so, given the experience that most people have had over the last 15 years, that feels onerous when you've locked in below 5, 6, 4, 3, whatever.
Well, and wasn't the whole idea, Ron, with the idea of interest rates going up was the higher interest rates were supposed to pull money out of the economy, but that's not really happening,
No,
right? Because
not at all.
if interest rates are supposed to drive housing prices down, right? That's not happening. My house, I assume, is appreciating, maybe not significantly like it did post COVID, but it's I'm not losing value on my house. Or certainly my cost base, I'm well above my cost basis of however many years ago.
And what happened too is that the increase in mortgage rates for new home buyers, or again, people who wanted to trade out, made it more difficult to do so. So people also have to understand we're coming off an entirely unusual period since the great financial crisis, where twice the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to zero, which meant that mortgage rates were, on average 3.5%, which is highly unusual. We're a 7% mortgage when I was growing up was considered affordable.
Yeah, but the house cost $28,000.
The house cost $28,000. Yeah, but having said that, well, actually, yeah, I guess I think my parents bought a house in 1963 for 21.5 in a suburb of Buffalo, which was about, I think, somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000 square feet. So you have bigger homes, you have higher mortgage rates, you have locked in supply, and so you have this problem that we're dealing with. And but still, mortgage rates historically are right about where they have been, around 7%. That is average, but it is sticker shock for anybody who has something meaningfully below that. And so, what the other reason, by the way, just to allude to what you said about higher rates not affecting the economy, households locked in those lower mortgage rates, and corporations locked in relatively long-term borrowing costs at low rates as well. So nobody got the typical sticker shock that you would get when the Fed raised rates as quickly as it did over the course of the last couple of years. So instead of everybody scrambling to refinance at higher rates and then, getting knocked out of their homes or having businesses pay up, that didn't happen. And so the economy continued to grow quite briskly. And right now, we just saw third quarter GDP revised up to 3.1% annual rate of growth. Fourth quarter expected to grow 3.2%. So the economy is still pretty hot, irrespective of where rates are.
All right, so let's talk about that. The economy is hot.
Yep.
They're revising upward the rate of growth, but let's go back to the second thing you mentioned, which was the cost of groceries, which is okay, great, Ron. Look, I do not live in, a nice, in a wealthy enclave like I do or you do. I live in a relatively speaking Midwest middle class neighborhood where, yeah, okay, I've had my mortgage for a long time, or maybe I've been renting for a long time, but the difference between, $150 and $200 a week in groceries is a lot, considering that what outrageous percentage of Americans don't have $400 in the bank in the case of an emergency. So how does that filter down to a lot of the people who express their displeasure, whether or not it was emotional, financial, or both? How do they say, oh, yeah, well, that's great for all you guys who are already in the system, but for me, in Wisconsin Rapids, I ain't feeling it.
Yeah, they're not feeling it. What's interesting about that, and there's a certain dichotomy, Reed, that goes here as well, which is that they may not be feeling it, but they are spending the money. Wages have outpaced the current rate of inflation for almost 2 years now, and we've seen some big wage hikes for companies who are either unionized or have some form of organized labor. Pilots. Delivery people. We've got two strikes going on right now, potentially at Amazon and Starbucks, and we've seen minimum wages go up in quite a number of states. So there is this interesting cognitive dissonance that's taking place, where if you go to a airport and it's packed, or you go to a restaurant, from McDonald's all the way up to the high end, these places are just overflowing with people. Everywhere I've been, I have seen people out and about, and yet they're complaining. What's very interesting is, since the election, Democrats now view the economy negatively and Republicans view it positively. So there's been this kind of, shift in perceptions about where the economy is right now. Yeah, groceries are definitely higher than they were in 2019 by, on average, 19%. Everybody talks about egg prices. Egg prices had nothing to do with the pandemic, had nothing to do with stimulus, had everything to do with bird flu.
Right,
And the reduction in the supply of chickens that lay eggs. And so, yeah, those would be hens, I guess.
right.
And so,
If roosters start laying eggs, this is a whole different show, Ron.
well, I guess that's part of the culture wars as well, that we've been dealing with over the last couple of years.
We call them birthing chickens, Ron.
Birthing chickens, yes, exactly. And we do not assign any gender to the egg
No.
as it's being hatched. But look, I mean, there are elements of inflation that are kind of hard to explain and that don't kind of fit into anybody's narrative, and almost all of it has to do with what happened during the pandemic. And so, people might be upset, but and I understand that if you're middle income or lower income, it is definitely a burden. But you did get assistance, which I think some people are now, still upset that they're not getting checks from the government anymore. But that was, trillions of dollars that went out the door to support people during a period in which the economy was not at full employment, which we are now. We're at very, high levels of unemployment. So, it's interesting to me. I understand it. I grew up in an environment where my parents couldn't afford things during the great inflation of the 70s and the 80s. And I'm sympathetic, but I also don't see people holding back. If you look at the GDP report from the third quarter, consumer spending was up 3.7%. That is extraordinarily strong.
I've spent a lot of time, as you have, Ron, in airports. They're never empty. There's never an empty seat on a plane. Now I know that airlines have reduced, the number of flights to keep planes full, which is not a new thing. But yeah, I mean, there are people hanging from rafters on every plane I've been on.
Yeah, exactly. Some
Right.
by choice, some not.
Right. And it's always such a pleasant experience.
Oh, it's lovely. Yeah, absolutely.
You know what? When the airline industry gets me to agree with Josh Hawley, I got a real problem. I
Yeah,
got a real freaking problem, Ron.
I
You
know. And
know,
it is big. Look, you and I both travel a lot. And, to be blunt, it sucks. I mean,
it does.
it's just not a good experience. And even whether you fly first or whether you fly economy plus or whether you fly economy, there, you go back to those pictures and the images of flying in the 60s where the seats were pretty wide. They had a smoking section, which was very strange. But, everybody was accommodating. Everybody was nice. Everybody got fed. Now that you've got cashless payments to get your little box of tapas and, and whatever else you can get while you're on the plane. Yeah, it's a horrible experience at too high a price. But at least it's safe. I'll give it that.
Yeah, I mean, it just as an aside, the smoking section. I mean, can you imagine a worse idea, A, for an enclosed space, pressurized oxygen, and everything in that craft is highly flammable?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
just like the common sense and physics alone should have been like, maybe guys, maybe not a good idea. But I digress. Okay, so let's fast forward to, people trying to make the problem worse, not better. So here we are now, as you and I are recording this. By the time people listen to this, the government might have shut down. We don't know yet. And again, I have to leave it to Donald Trump and Elon Musk to get me to agree with a guy like Chip Roy, who I loathe to no end, right? He's a former chief of staff to Ted Cruz, which makes him even more loathsome. But, when he's standing at the lectern looking not to his left at the Democratic caucus, but to his right, to his own conference and saying, you people are embarrassing. Right now, whether or not it's because, they said we want to cut all this stuff the Democrats wants, but we want you to raise our credit card limit, which is ultimately the debt limit. He's not wrong. And there's plenty of reason to be frustrated about this. And, I say that is also like right before we came on, I was like, why is anybody surprised? Like, what did you think was going to happen? Like, if you are a rather not d I would say disaffected, but not uninformed voter, but you voted because you're like, "I don't like anybody, and Trump makes me feel better when I don't like anybody." Right? But if you live in the economic sector, if you live in Washington, DC, and you practice politics, like, all of the, like, hand-wringing and hair on fire stuff, like, again, guys, you should it's okay to be frustrated, but, like, we knew what was gonna happen. None of this was a surprise.
No, none of it's surprising. I don't know if the word is tweeted or xed. Whatever I did last night was, I found it interesting that incoming President Trump or President-elect Trump suggested they suspend the debt ceiling
Right.
at the same time that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy want to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget. If indeed they did that, there would be absolutely no need to suspend the debt limit because you would not go over it. You would reduce spending by $2 trillion, which would more than offset whatever is in the pipeline. And so I'm now at a loss to understand what it is that they're trying to accomplish. So if you suspend the debt limit, on the one hand, I used to agree with that because we have to pay our bills and we have interest on the debt. You can't default and all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, if you're committed to cutting spending, which is not the case with this particular stopgap bill that's in front of the House at the moment. If you're committed to cutting spending, why are you raising the debt limit? So there's all kinds of like conflicting signals coming out of here, and quite frankly, we don't know who's driving the thought process. Is Elon Musk leading and Donald Trump following, or is Donald Trump whispering to Elon Musk, "Hey, do this on X"? Give me some cover, and then JD Vance and I'll come out, 10 hours, 12 hours later and support the 100 tweets that you just put out, calling into question the logic of this particular set of proposals.
Well, right now it seems as if somebody drove to New Mexico, filled up a big crate, and delivered tons of peyote to the White House for everybody to just go into some sort of fever dream. Because but here's the point: it's not supposed to make any sense, right? And there's no possible way it could. And this is where the reality, I think, Ron, of a bureaucracy the size of the federal government, a country the size and establishment of the United States, it's not moving a pirate ship, right? Even for Elon Musk, this is a battleship, right? And moving it a degree is a big deal. Moving it more than a couple of degrees, right, often requires like throwing most of the crew off because most of them be like, we're never going to do this. But then you have all the entrenched interests, right? Which is Elon wants to cut $2 trillion out of the government, but I promise it ain't going to be out of SpaceX or Starlink or Tesla rebates or anything like that. And then, even Trump, for all of his insanity, has always been very wary of going anywhere near Social Security and Medicare, right? Like he's crazy and he's not intellectual, but like he understands, sort of the bread and butter, which is if old people start hearing that I'm cutting these entitlements, like they're going to be unhappy.
And justifiably so. Listen, I mean, all those people who are current recipients have paid in. I'm more than willing to, and you and I both accepted a 67-year-old retirement age, which was, changed in 1983 when they did in fact address Social Security's unfunded liabilities. They raised the retirement age to 67 from 65. And if you look at millennials and Gen Z and beyond, those folks are likely to live considerably longer than any other generation. And so let's say you bump the retirement age up to 70 and you dramatically reduce the unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare, right? That's a logical thing. And you can explain that to future generations. You can't take money away from current recipients. That would be a revolutionary type of thing where seniors would demonstrate at best demonstrate en masse because they would be, losing their purchasing power. And at the same time, President Trump said, don't tax Social Security. So again, going back to the notion of cognitive dissonance, there's just a ton of it right now. And yeah, if you're going to try to cut $2 trillion, 14% of the federal budget is non-defense discretionary spending, which is the only thing effectively you can cut because you got Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, and interest on the debt eating up the other 86%. So good luck trying to touch all that stuff.
All right, but of those, right, like defense is cuttable. It is reducible. And that's one where too, I think, you talk about the cognitive dissonance, which is a lot of the people in the Trump orbit are isolationists. We don't want America being the world's police force, right? If Russia wants to run roughshod over Ukraine, that's fine. If China's going to
And
do
then
it, it's going to
Poland. Yeah.
right. Yeah, whatever it is. Well, I mean, I just as an aside, like my guess is that the Balts and the Poles and the Romanians, like they're like, we're not going back. Right? Like, try again, Vlad. Let's see what happens. But that's the thing is like, so let's make it a logical argument to the sake that for the purposes of trying to be sane here, Ron. Let's say that okay, that there are in future defense budgets 4 more aircraft carriers on the books. Okay. Does the United States in 2070 need 4 more aircraft carriers? Like, I don't know.
We're going to have a ton of drones, so we probably don't.
Right. And all of the other things that could be, utilized to take it out. Of course, an aircraft carrier is a floating, it's a power projection. But my point is the reason why this makes it much more difficult is because Elon's like, okay, we want to get rid of the F-35, where they're built in Fort Worth, Texas. Like Ted Cruz is like, you're not touching the F-35.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
You're not touching the F-35. And so that's one of those things where it's like, that remember going back to was David Halberstam and the smartest guys in the room, right? Wars don't end until the Pentagon and the bureaucracy are ready for the war to end, right? Like, we're not going to stop building F-35s until and unless the Pentagon and the defense, industrial complex are decided that we don't want the F-35 anymore. But they'll only do that because, Ron, they're going to build something more expensive, right? Not less expensive. And so that's the other part, too, is like all the stuff you're talking about, like defense is the only place you could legitimately say, there are hundreds of billions, if not trillions, that over the course of a decade you could pull out. But of course, that also puts paid to the idea of the Republican Party's, quote, the party of national security.
Yeah, it's interesting. The two people that I hold dear in my heart, Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, who back in 2010 released the Simpson Bowles Commission report, which addressed that very issue. Prior to the release of that plan, the defense budget had not been audited, I think, since the 1970s. Now, lately it's been audited and the Defense Department has failed its audits from a budget perspective. But they, too, pointed out that you could streamline defense spending. Now, they were also still benefiting at the time from the peace dividend that started in 1989 and carried on through the Clinton years and to a certain extent, even through to the Obama years. We don't have that peace dividend now, but it doesn't mean that the Pentagon should be able to engage in or its suppliers in waste, fraud, and abuse to hundreds of billions of dollars. So I would agree with you that there are opportunities there to cut, and there are opportunities to address unfunded liabilities in the entitlement programs. What the proposals we've seen from the Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, which Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy presumably run an extra governmental commission, nothing like Simpson Bowles. They're talking about, stripping veteran benefits, pediatric cancer treatment chair,
which they already did.
It doesn't make sense. And to me, it's purposefully mean. And some people have said, that the meanness is the point. in some of these, particular proposals.
Right.
All they have to do is dust off Simpson balls and update it relative to the size of the debts and deficits that we've accumulated over the years, and go about it in a way that's as measured and as intelligent as Allen and Erskine put together, so many years ago now. So this notion of, kind of, from a tech bro perspective, is move fast and break things. That's very hard to do, and it's also extremely damaging to the infrastructure of the country. And I don't mean the physical infrastructure per se, which they also want to gut some of the spending there, but the bureaucracy is actually necessary. And they make it out to be much larger than it really is. It's 2.4 million people. It is 1/10 of all government employees that work for the federal government. The rest, if you count teachers, policemen, firefighters, and others, work at the state and municipal level. And so they're really talking about apples and oranges when they talk about these budgets, and deconstructing the administrative state, as Steve Bannon wanted to put it. It's not wise to gut the system. There are so many unintended consequences if you do that.
Well, remember too that for a guy like Bannon, he's a self-avowed Leninist and not John Lennon, but Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. But that's also a means of control, right? I want to get rid of the bureaucracy because I want more direct control over what happens.
Yeah, and that opens or paves the way for executive orders and less congressional oversight of the actions coming out of the White House, and less bureaucratic interference from those folks who might just slow walk any of the regulatory orders or executive orders that come out of the White House.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I don't think that Elon Musk is stupid. I think he's crazy, and I think he's misguided. I think Ramaswamy is dumb. I think he is stupid. I think he's a carnival barker. Neither one of them, though, I think understand the morass with which they are climbing into. But again, maybe they don't care because it's like everything. Oh yeah, we know how to fix it. We'll run government like a business. Okay.
God, how many times have we heard this in the course of my lifetime? It's, you need to run the government like you run your household budget, or you need to run the government like you run a business. Well, businesses and households don't print money. Businesses and
Right.
households don't have a Federal Reserve. Businesses and households don't have a treasury that has the power to tax. So yes, you live within your means, or at least try to if you're a household or a business. A government is an entirely different operation and also serves an entirely different function. It is not a for-profit enterprise. And so the notion that you're going to, run a surplus or a profit is great in theory. It happened once in 2000 at the end of Bill Clinton's term, but that was the result of so many positive factors that were occurring at the time. An overheated stock market that generated capital gains. That we had the peace dividend, so defense spending actually came down in real terms. We're not going through any of that right now, and so yes, there are ways to right size government spending and do it in an intelligent and, I think, predictable and meaningful way, so that everyone can understand what's going on, as opposed to taking a meat axe to the budget and causing all kinds of chaos. And again, as you've suggested and others have suggested, maybe the chaos is the point.
Well, so we've spent the last 10 or 15 minutes on the expenditure side of the ledger. We have not at all touched the revenue side of the ledger, which is, there are a large number of Americans like you and me, right, who make a certain amount of money, and we're capped. Our Social Security and Medicare contributions are capped at what, like $100,000.
130,000. Yeah.
130, yeah. And there are obviously hyper wealthy individuals who, if you look back 10 years ago, are 10x, 15, 20x more wealthy than they were. So let me ask you this. I mean, is there a need for additional revenue? Because again, if you just put it on paper and said we're going to raise the debt ceiling to X, but we're going to cut the government by Y, and it all sort of pencils out, it still doesn't account for the trillions of dollars of debt we have. Now, again, we're the United States, we're the empire, so that's not going to end tomorrow. That's probably going to end 100 years from now, if it ever. I mean, it won't end in our lifetime, probably.
Probably
But
not.
is there a revenue side of this that needs to be addressed as well?
Well, there should be, and there could be. It's just not going to happen, right? I mean, this is not an administration that suggested that they're going to raise taxes on billionaires or corporations. In fact, the incoming administration has proposed lowering the corporate tax rate from 21 to 15%. Absolutely unnecessary. Corporations have been, making record profits now for quite a number of years. Individuals who are extremely wealthy have a wide variety of tools at their disposal to avoid paying taxes altogether. I don't know if you saw this, Jeff Bezos, who recently moved to Florida and sold $14 billion worth of Amazon stock, avoided paying $1 billion in taxes just by making that move. So And then you have all these various vehicles, these different types of trusts, these different types of insurance policies.
1031 exchanges.
That's mostly for real estate, but
Yeah, I know, but it's the same idea, right?
same thing. Yeah, no capital gains are ever paid. It doesn't make me popular with the real estate community, but at the commercial level, where a lot of these individuals, including the current president, have benefited from these 1031 exchanges. If you buy a property after having sold a property for equal or greater value, you don't pay capital gains tax on the profit that you made from the prior sale. And so you defer any taxes in perpetuity. And that's true in a lot of ways with some of these generation skipping trusts that very wealthy individuals have established in their insurance policies. You can tag onto that defer, if not eliminate, both estate and income taxes forever. So, yeah, would there be more enforcement? You've heard many Republicans saying they want to strip the IRS of the additional funding that they got recently, so that there'd be fewer audits or of individuals who use those tools. Nobody wants to roll back the 1031 exchange. Nobody wants to eliminate Gratz and Clatz, which are the two of the types of trusts that I was referencing, or do anything else in that regard to find a way to raise taxes, or even just directly raise the tax rate on ultra wealthy individuals. That's out the window this year or next year.
So we were talking about the average American who is muddling to get by. And you mentioned that, in the course of COVID, they were doing the Ben Bernanke throwing money from helicopters thing, and people got used to it. We didn't call it socialism.
No.
So are we just talking a matter of language, right? Which is like, it's okay for us to give away money in certain circumstances if we call it one thing, like universal basic income. I don't know enough about it, whether or not it's a good idea or a bad idea. You give everybody $1,000 a month, when they turn 18 or whatever the case might be. So, I mean, that's my question is like, are we talking about government giveaways? Is that the solution? We used to think in the old line Republican Party run, right? Like a rising tide lifts all boats. Now it seems to be a rising tide lifts only yachts. So how do you break through, the people who, whether or not they're, as you mentioned, millennials, Gen Zs, or people of all ages who do not live in major cities or major metropolitan areas, for whom, we've heard this now several times, that their kids may not be as well off as they were. I mean, how do you start to solve that problem?
Although it's interesting, there's a lot of data that flies in the face of that. Millennials actually are more wealthy than their baby boomer counterparts at the same age.
How many fewer kids do you think they're having?
Yeah, a lot. But they're also about to stand to inherit $84 trillion from the baby boom generation, right? So there is this huge intergenerational wealth transfer that's coming to millennials, Gen Y, Gen Z, and those beyond that, which will probably keep them in good stead. Now, there are a lot of reasons why they're not having kids, right? I mean, it's not just the expense. There are lifestyle issues around having numerous children that seem to be affecting millennials and Gen Z kids. And I know this from my own kids, at least one of whom is less inclined to have children.
And not just here. I mean, all over the world.
All over the world. Yeah, we're saying, I mean, listen, China's population is expected to go from 1.4 billion today to 535 million in 2100.
Right.
That's partly because of the one-child policy, but they're also disinclined to have kids because in China, it's really expensive to have a child, even more so than it is here.
And Korea and Japan are, wasting away, literally.
Japan is a liquidating asset, right? They have more deaths than they have births. They have more centenarians than they have young children. And so, they're on that path. South Korea's on that path. Italy's on that path. We are to a certain extent, and this is the thing. This is where to get into the real third rail of American politics now, which is no longer entitlements, but immigration. Immigration is the answer to the current population and demographic problems that we have in the United States. I've said this publicly in a wide variety of places, and I've taken a lot of heat for it, but we have 10,000 Americans still turning 65 every day until 2030. We have a birth rate that is near just off its record lows of 1.6 children per woman, and the replacement rate's 2.1. So how do you fill the gap? Which is the way with the exception of the baby boom, the way in which the United States has filled the gap has always been immigration, by definition, right? So that is a solution. And if you look at like the labor force, which was bolstered by non-native workers, if you will, and now that may be reversed, that could be a severely damaging policy to the labor force, to wage inflation, to the ability to get things done, whether it's constructing new homes, which we've already talked about, which is, a wide variety of industries, hospitality, landscaping, lawn care, healthcare,
Yeah, service industries. Yeah.
service industries across the board. That problem vexes me most when I look at what we're facing, along with this kind of tariff issue that the incoming president keeps throwing around. Those are the two issues that I think would be most damaging to the economy if they're enacted on day one, as has been suggested.
It's interesting. So, to go halfway around the world. So, the Bashar al-Assad regime fell, last week. And the group that's taken over for him is also on the terrorist list in the United States. So, not exactly. Probably, we don't know exactly what we're getting. I know they're trying desperately now, as I heard on the news this morning, to change their behavior enough to shed that label because it makes it, so long as they're on the terror watch list, it makes it almost impossible for aid to get into Syria. But I heard another report, though, Ron, that there were something like 1 million Syrians who were already deciding, who had moved to Europe, and probably one of the greatest, human transfers in modern history, right? We're thinking about going back. And so it's one of the, it's interesting. I'm just now thinking about this. To your point about immigration, is so a lot of the European countries are facing the same thing that we are, not to the extent he's getting Japan or South Korea. But like now you're going to pull 1 million people, maybe more than 1 million people out of the European economy, out of the European workforce, right? They're going to go back. They're going to cause a problem in Europe by leaving, and they're going to cause another problem in Syria by returning, right? And so that's one of those things too that we just, you never like, history always surprises us, right? We always think we know how things are going, and then it pops up and says, "Oh no, you don't. No, you don't." But that's the other part too. Is I think about the context. Let me get real nerdy here, of like industrial policy or economic policy that is designed to outstrip a given Congress or a given administration, because people who have understood these issues, or at least have a vision for the future, have said this is the direction we're going to go in. Now you can make you know differences here and there, but maybe they should be based on like what we've learned. Okay, if we have a 10-year, and I'm not talking about like a 5-year plan of the Soviet Union. That's not what I'm talking about. But an industrial policy that says we're going to look for ways to increase domestic manufacturing. We're going to find ways to replace or increase domestic infrastructure, whatever the case might be, right? Those are things you can't do in 2 and 4 year cycles, right? You have to make a commitment to those. So maybe is all that, and now I'm going to ask you a philosophical question, is all that just downstream from our larger sort of political and social issues, which we just can't agree on anything?
Thankfully, the Biden administration tackled, two of those issues that you just brought up. I mean, we are restoring domestic manufacturing through a series of incentives. We did, in fact, launch an infrastructure bill that was, poorly named the Inflation Reduction Act. But I know that, the streets around my house are now, for the first time in 5 years, getting paid thanks to the federal monies that are flowing to the lovely state of New Jersey, which had neglected the roads for quite some time. I think on Saturday Night Live, there was a joke about New Jersey being voted the worst roads in America, and the second worst roads were any road that led to New Jersey. So we are addressing that issue, and so and there's this philosophical issue as you describe it now between the Biden administration, which created a series of incentives for onshoring or reshoring manufacturing of high technology goods like semiconductors and other technology products, restoring infrastructure, tens of thousands of bridges, miles and miles of roads. And now President Trump saying he wants to use tariffs to bring companies back to the United States to do business here to avoid being hit with a 25% levy if you're in Mexico or Canada, a 60% levy if you're operating out of China. Don't think it works that way. And we saw in his last administration that it simply didn't. In fact, the government paid out more money to industries like agriculture that were harmed by tariffs than it actually did any good. Once somebody stops buying U.S. soybeans like China, you end up spending $50 billion in subsidies to support farmers who are going out of business.
That's a good point too, which is I think that if I look back at the first Trump administration, and I'm not sure we're prepared for it now, Ron, but I think that we weren't prepared to address at the local level, right, and the state level, the things like that, which is he did these things and like we explained it, but like if the farmers are getting compensated, like I maybe they don't care. And I don't wanna I'm not denigrating farmers, but if you're a soybean farmer and you can't sell $1,000,000 worth of soybeans, but the feds cough up $1,000,000, like, I don't know. Do you care? Does it
I think you do
matter?
care because you're also sitting on, surplus soybeans then because you can't sell them anywhere. And so, yes, you're getting that subsidy, but the price inherently is going to come down because you've got a domestic surplus or domestic glut of soybeans. So it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. I mean, the more prices fall, the more the government's going to have to subsidize you. And then what do you do? There's no end game there, right? I mean, unless you can sell these things overseas. And one of the few places where the United States has an enormous surplus is in agriculture, right? That is one of our biggest exports besides movies and, entertainment, social media, and other toxic.
Right, right. Let's see, we sell oil, we sell guns, we sell yes, we sell all the good stuff. I know we are like the bad older brother of the entire world. But let me talk about tariffs here in North America for a second because I thought that it was so demonstrative of the two reactions from the president of Mexico and the prime minister of Canada when Trump said that. The president of Mexico is like, you buy way more stuff from us than we do from you, bring it on, right? And and then the flip side was Justin Trudeau, who, by the end of this episode might not have a job. Went to Mar-a-Lago as fast as his little arms would carry him, right? And now what's happened is that, Trump continually refers to Canada as the 51st state. Now, of course, 75% of their economy is in business with the United States. And talking to a friend of mine who's actually Canadian, right? This has always been an undercurrent of fear in Canada. Is like at some point, the U.S. would, want their resources. And I remember, 30 years ago, this old bit from Jon Stewart, like when he's still doing stand up, and he said, my Canadian said, what do Americans really think about Canada? And he said, like, we don't. And like, but no, no, really, really, what do you think about Canada? And he does this. He goes, hey, Canada, it's us. We're out of wood. Get out. Right? But, like, that's a joke, and it was funny, but not to Canadians.
Not the Canadians. And look, and we had one of the governors, I guess, of a Canadian province who said, go ahead and put on tariffs. We're going to stop selling you energy products. We rely on Canada for a wide range of energy products, as we do Mexico. There's one piece that I understand about Mexico, which is China is transshipping electric vehicles through Mexico to the United States to avoid tariffs. Now, that can be dealt with individually. But President Trump, in his first term, renegotiated NAFTA and created the USMCA, which was the successor agreement to NAFTA, in which we got a handful of small benefits. But if you put tariffs on Canada and Mexico, you violate the terms of the very treaty that he renegotiated and will blow that up.
But again, you're assuming he cares.
I don't think he cares. And listen, this is the other thing, going back to, and I've said this in a couple other venues, going back to 2016 when we were talking about, do we take him seriously? Do we take him literally? Do we take him literally? Do we take him seriously? This time around, I think we take him both. I think on day one, they will attempt to impose all those tariffs. I think on day one, they will attempt to launch a mass deportation program. And I think they're very serious about doing this. I don't think this is a negotiating position. I don't think it's posturing. I think it is, bedrock to the very plans they have for the United States going forward. They view these things as integral to, as you were saying before, becoming more and more isolationist. And we know from the 1930s that that's a very bad idea. The U.S. Army was drilling with broomsticks in the 1930s, just before World War II. You do not want to disengage. And for some reason, whether it's Steve Bannon, whether it's Peter Thiel, whether it's any number of presumed intellectuals who have this political ideology of the United States withdrawing from the world, it has served us quite well to have been involved in the world. Obviously, we've made some massive mistakes along the way, but the bedrock relationships that we have with Europe, with NATO, with Pacific nations like Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Australia, these relationships have served us quite well. Global trade, by and large, has served us reasonably well. But we've made some serious management mistakes by letting the Japanese take the U.S. car market, by letting the Chinese, beat us in electric vehicles, by letting the Chinese beat us in solar. Those are fundamental management and policy errors that were made in the context of globalization, but it wasn't necessarily globalization that caused those problems. So I think they misidentify the root cause of these issues and their inability to be creative to solve the various competitive challenges that we've had along the way.
all of that redounds to the detriment of the average American, which is to your point. I've talked about we talk about immigration as a net economic good. If you take 11, 12 million people out of the country, right? That's 11 or 12 million people out of the workforce, not paying rent, not paying for gas, not paying for groceries.
Not paying taxes.
Yeah, that's what I mean, and maybe it's not income tax, but it's some sort of tax. And then on the flip side, they're not buying anything either,
Right.
right? And then you add the tariff on top, which is nobody else is going to buy anything either, because now the cheap television that was like, oh, 95 inches for $1,000. Now it's 95 inches for $2,500. Like, forget it. I'll just keep watching the same television. Because the truth is, like, I don't need that many Black Friday deals. Like, a television is not like something I need to replace every year. It's like a couch.
This is why stagflation is the thing I now worry about. Larry Summers, for years after the great financial crisis, and then again after the pandemic, was crowing about the possibility, the risk of stagflation. Never happened. These are the ingredients for stagflation to occur: recession and inflation simultaneously. If you were to implement all these programs simultaneously, and I think that is my biggest worry: is that the financial markets, bond markets starting to, but broadly speaking, the financial markets are looking at the positives of potential tax cuts and deregulation, but ignoring the negatives, which might simply overwhelm any attempts to lower taxes or to deregulate certain industries.
Well, and then, from the political side, from the ruling side, I'm not going to call it government side, ruling side, Ron, is that you have a group of people now who I believe, one, will tell people whatever it is they think they want to hear, whether it's true or not coming out of government. And two, if people start to get upset, right, maybe they just roll federal officers into the street and say, stay in your house or shut up. Or maybe they do now start to take, opponents and turn them into dissidents, right? And so that's my fear, is that if things go bad, their reaction will not be to reverse course to make them better, but to clamp down, which is also not an unusual thing. Let me ask you, as I go, so there's this show on Paramount Plus called Landman,
Yeah.
and it's about the Texas oil industry.
Thrilled to see Allie Larder back, by the way. I really have always enjoyed her work.
She's very good. She's very funny. She's got that sort of, she really captured that sort of wry Texas wit, which I thought was great. And Billy Bob Thornton is his Billy Bob Thorntoniest, right? But there's this, and I might have asked another guest about this, so to the listeners, I'll apologize if I'm stuck on it. But there's a scene in which there's a like highfalutin lawyer who comes out to the Permian Basin to talk about, something they've got to fix. So she says, oh, they're windmills. Oh yeah, we got more than anybody. And so he takes her out there, and she keeps calling it green energy, and he looks over at her and says alternative. And like, these things are huge if you've ever seen one up close, right? And he
Yeah, and
goes,
also Texas is the state that is farthest along in alternative energy, rather
right.
ironically.
I know, which also doesn't support its grid, but that's a whole other episode. But he talks about, do you know how much greenhouse gas goes in from the diesel just to pour these things? And then he goes into this thing, and I thought it was really interesting, Ron. It was like, Billy Bob did a really good job saying we have a 130-year petroleum-based industry, right? Or 120-year, right? It would take us more than a century if we started yesterday. Even if we started nuclear, it takes 30 years to build the transmission lines. And that really got me to thinking. Now, I've done work for oil companies, so believe me, I'm under no illusions about how oil companies operate. But I thought it was a really good way to explain that, like, how do we start to address that in a way that's like legitimately like, okay, here's where we are, right? This stuff is not good for the environment. It's bad for the air, right? It causes us to rely on very bad people who really don't have our best interests at heart. But like, it is a reality of the situation. How do we turn an issue like the environment from one of like, we're all going to die, but that's going to happen one way or the other, to like, okay, this is the reality in which we are operating. How do we mitigate the things we're operating while we start to bring online things that can reduce our need for that? And maybe that goes back to industrial policy, energy policy, all that.
It does. I would lay at least some of the intellectual blame or philosophical blame on the people who originally talked about climate change as destroying the planet. And George Carlin and others have opined, the late great George Carlin said, we cannot destroy the planet. We can only destroy us. And so the argument was always tilted in such a way as like, oh, we're going to destroy the earth. It's like, no, we're not. The dinosaurs didn't destroy the earth. Species have come and gone. They don't hurt the planet. The planet heals itself. We will destroy our habitat, our way of life, our ability to be healthy. And, I think that was the first mistake. The second is allowing people to, you know, engage in this issue, and we've seen this now again in healthcare with vaccines, to dismiss science as entirely bogus, despite all the work that goes into scientific assessments of what's happening with climate, where we know we're 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than we were. We're seeing it in real time play out, and yet people want to argue that something's not happening. So I don't know. You need to get some uniformity of opinion here that this is actually taking place. And look, I think Obama was right in his initial estimates that you engage in an all of the above approach to energy, and modular nuclear power is efficient, it's smaller, it's safer, and it's much, much easier to roll out. And again, I agree with you. We have to address the transmission line issue, which has not been touched since the 1970s. We have to build out the ability to take, whether it's solar battery stored power, any kind of wind, solar, nuclear energy, and be able to distribute that effectively across the country. And the problem here, Reed, as you well know, is there's no consensus, and you have so many people fighting the very real issue of climate change. I was an early skeptic. I thought that we've seen things like this before, where 1970s somebody claimed that there was another ice age coming, and then it was global warming, then it was climate change, and it kept changing, and reiterating and coming back in different forms. I think if you look around now, the evidence is irrefutable. I just don't know how you get the people who are opposed to this notion on board, which then in turn supports policy that is, pro-environment, if you will, without sounding like you're, a 1960s long-haired hippie who, is eating string cheese and walking around going, "Oh, dude, we got to fix this." There's this like this weird kind of, presumption that everybody who's worried about the environment is, crunchy granola. When in fact, there's some really legitimate people who think we have to do something and do something now, or should have done something 20 years ago. I'm stymied because there's no consensus, and without a consensus, you can't fix the problem.
Right, and look, as someone whose homeowners insurance got dropped this past summer for wildfires, right, or for all the people in coastal Florida, in coastal Louisiana, or anywhere in California, whether or not it's earthquakes or wildfires can't get insured, like, it's real, and it has real effects.
What you raised, this insurance issue, I think that's the trigger for people to change their minds. Because no matter where you are, whether it's wildfires on the West Coast, whether it's sea level rise along the East Coast, or whether it's a host of like wild storm activity around the country where you can't get insured, that's going to matter to people at some point.
Well, you can't get a mortgage without it.
Correct. Yeah.
So at some point, yeah, and if the American dream, such as it is still home ownership, right? It's still the most valuable asset most people will ever own, but you can't get it because you live 2 miles inside what's a designated flood area or whatever by, AIG or, you name it, right? Then, none of it works. So now you don't have enough houses, and you don't have enough houses in the right places. So, Ron, before I let you go, first and foremost, thank you for staying for this now supersized episode. As always, you and I, when we get to talking, it's hard to get us to stop. Where can our listeners find you online? Where can we find out about your company and where you write, all that?
So on X, on Facebook, still nominally, on Instagram, still on CNBC a little later today, along with MSNBC, quite frequently with Stephanie Rule. So that's generally where I am. CNBC.com is where I write. So that is where I'm found.
Awesome. As always, gang, you can find me on Twitter, TikTok for like another 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I think, and says.us at Reed Galen. You can find me on Instagram and Threads at Reed_Galen USA. As always, gang, on Substack. And please follow us on YouTube. Give us 5-star reviews. Guys, we need your help to keep this community growing. Ron, thank you so much for joining. I hope you and your family have a very Merry Christmas.
You also, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.